Last weekend, I wasn't here, so if you were here, you may have noticed that, because I was back in Ohio, and I had the honor and privilege of officiating at my daughter's wedding, and they're here today, so my daughter and her new husband are here, and my mom and dad, my son, my aunt, and cousin are all here today, and so that's been wonderful. We had a house full from Ohio, too. Most of them left yesterday, and so they're not here, but it's been a great week. The night before the wedding, we pulled out some old family videos that my daughter had at her house, and we watched these old family videos, which is always a lot of fun. And in one of the videos, my oldest son, Ryan, was about 5, and my younger son, Joel, who's here today, was, I think, about 2 years old. And I had forgotten exactly how much Joel idolized his big brother back then. So every time Ryan would say something for the camera, Joel would try to say that. He would copy it in the cutest way possible. You couldn't really understand him, but you could tell what he was trying to do, right? And so every time Ryan would bust out a new dance move for the camera, or do a somersault on the living room floor, Joel would be right behind him trying to do it. Trying to do the same thing. So the point of all of that is to say that Ryan was his role model. And if I remember correctly, the fact that Ryan was Joel's role model also made the whole potty training thing with Joel a whole lot easier. I mean, it was a breeze. I mean, this is one of my favorite stories to tell about Joel. I'm so glad he's here today so that I could tell this about him while he's here. So one day, we weren't even planning to, we hadn't even started working with him on this. We just found him on the toilet doing his business because that's what his brother did. And so literally we put big boy underwear on him that day, that same day, and he never wore another diaper again after that. Easiest potty training in the history of potty training. Exactly. Thank you. Yes. Let's all hear it for Joel. Now, I'm also pretty sure Ryan taught him some other things that weren't so helpful. That was helpful, but he taught him some things that weren't so helpful. But that's how role models work. When we look up to somebody, we consciously and often unconsciously adopt their ways of thinking, their ways of talking, their ways of acting. Their habits become our habits. Their values become our values. And that can be good, and that can be bad. It can be both. I'm convinced one of the reasons that the Bible exists is to give us role models for how to walk in the ways of faith and love. That's what those stories are all about. Everywhere in the Bible, you see great examples of what to do and also what not to do. If you spend any time at all reading your Bible, then you know it includes lots and lots of bad examples. Probably as many or more bad examples as good examples. I mean, going clear back to the beginning, right? Right out of the gate, there's Adam and Eve. They lived in the Garden of Eden. They had everything they could ever possibly want. They had a perfect love relationship with each other and with God, but they wanted more. They wanted God-like power. That was really what they wanted, God-like knowledge and power. And the next generation was even worse, right? You've got the story of Adam and Eve's son Cain murdering his brother. One generation in, and you've got fratricide, brother murdering brother in a jealous rage. Second generation. The Bible also tells hard truths about characters that we sometimes, or that we usually think of as good guys. Lots and lots of those. So, example of that, King David falls into that category. Overall, David was a model of faith and good leadership, but he was far from perfect. And the Bible makes that very clear. You know, the whole scandal of the affair with Bathsheba and the cover-up, the murder of her husband Uriah, that was a disaster. So you are welcome to follow in the footsteps of David and to use him as a role model, but only up to a point, right? Only up to a point. The Bible gives us a lot of real life examples of what faith looks like and doesn't look like, and we learn as much from people's failures as we do from their successes. But beginning this week, we're going to be looking at some of the giants of the Bible when it comes to positive role models. That's what we're going to be doing through the rest of the summer. And first up today is a woman. So that's where we're going to start. In fact, it's actually the story of two women. One who was a recognized political and military leader in the early days of Israel, and another one who worked behind the scenes, but was just as fierce and just as faithful as the first. So their names were Deborah and Jael. But before I tell you their story, I need to give you a little bit of a historical context so you know what was going on historically during their story. So when Moses led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. There's a bunch of bad examples in that too, but we won't go into that today. So eventually, after 40 years, and most of that generation had died off, Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land, and the 12 tribes settled in the land of Canaan, the land that had been promised to Abraham way, way back. So at that time, Israel was a loose confederation of 12 tribes. They did not have a king. They did not have a central government because God was their king. That was how they understood it. God was their leader. But occasionally they would need a leader, a human leader, to get them organized. And oftentimes that was so that they could defend themselves against a foreign enemy, some kind of a foreign threat. And so God raised up judges in order to meet those needs. So a couple of examples of names that you would recognize from this part of Israel's history. Samson was a judge in Israel during the threat of the Philistines. Gideon was another one. That's a great story, and he's a great role model too. Good and bad, just like Samson, actually. Gideon was judge during the threat of the Midianites and defeated them. So judges weren't elected. They didn't inherit their office from their parents. Everybody just recognized their gifts and turned to them for help. So they became leaders by consensus. Everyone agreed. They just agreed. This person has the gifts and the skills and the leadership necessary to help get us through this crisis. And that's how Deborah also became a judge. She was a great role model. She just was. And everybody knew it. Everybody knew it. Now, typically, a judge would rule for a certain period of time. Often they would defeat a foreign enemy, right? Because that was a part of usually what was going on. Then they would often, maybe always, they would lead the nation in spiritual renewal. Because one of Israel's biggest issues was idolatry. They would forget who was their primary person to worship, the primary God, and they would turn to other things, other people, other gods, other religions. And so these judges would lead them back into faithfulness, back into faith in God. And then that would be followed by a period of peace and prosperity. And sometimes that peace would last for decades, but eventually Israel would fall back into its old, idolatrous, unfaithful ways. And we see that in the opening verses of our scripture reading today from Judges chapter 4. Okay, so beginning at verse 1, it says, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay, again, they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So Ehud was the judge that preceded Deborah. So he led, there was a period of faithfulness, and then bam, they're back to their old ways again. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera. That's an important name to remember. He's a key player in the story, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. The Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, for Sisera had 900 chariots of iron and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years. At that time, Deborah, a prophetess, wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take position at Mount Tabor, bringing 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand." Barak said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go." And she said, "I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman." Then Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh. Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 warriors went up behind him, and Deborah went up with him. So that's the setup. That's the setup for this story. Deborah, it turns out, was a brilliant military strategist. She had 10,000 foot soldiers. She had a good man named Barak to lead them. But she knew she was going up against an experienced Canaanite general named Sisera, who had 900 iron chariots. Israel simply didn't have access to weapons like that. And that was scary. That was scary. And but Deborah had a plan, and it worked. So she led Sisera and his chariots to a plain at the foot of Mount Tabor, and where the river Kishon was. So there's a river there and a kind of a plain where they would do this battle. And as they fought, it began to rain, just as Deborah knew it would, that God would provide for them. And the river basin flooded, and Sisera's 900 chariots of mass destruction were suddenly stuck in the mud, and they couldn't go anywhere. They were useless to Jabin and his army. And so Israel's army then swept in and destroyed them. But somehow, Sisera, the general, got away. So he deserted his army, which wasn't very honorable, and he ran to the camp of a man named Heber the Kenite. Now, Heber and Sisera's boss, King Jabin, were allies. So Sisera thought, logically, that he was going to be safe there. But he didn't count on Jael. Jael was Heber's wife. And she invited him, when he got to the camp, she invited him into their tent, and she offered him water. But then she gave him warm milk instead to make him sleepy. And she covered him up with a blanket, and she tucked him in. And some of you know where the story's going. Some of you don't. I know that. And she promised to guard the tent so that nobody would come in. And while Sisera dozed off and slept, Jael took a tent peg and a hammer, and she nailed his head to the floor. Yeah, that story's in the Bible. Yep. Deborah was the wise and courageous leader who set this whole thing up, but it was Jael who finished this job. There's no doubt about it. Just as Deborah predicted that she would, right? She was the one that struck the final blow that brought them ultimate victory. Now, obviously, this is not a story that typically gets taught in Sunday school, which is probably why many of you have never heard it before, or at Vacation Bible School. But it's a great story. It's a great story. And it gives us, one of the things I love about it is that it gives us women role models that are doing something other than having babies, right? Which is a lot of what we find in the Bible. It gives us women role models who are doing something other than playing supporting roles in men's stories. They're the stars by far of this story. And they could be, obviously, just as bold and just as brutal as any man. Just ask Jael in her tent peg, right? One of my friends on Facebook, just this past week, posted a meme that really caught my attention. And this is what it said. I love this because this is super Bible geek stuff here. If you can't handle me at my Judges 4 and 5, you don't deserve me at my Proverbs 31. Right? You got to be a real Bible geek to get this one. So Judges 4 and 5 is is the story that we just went over of Deborah and Jael, right? Proverbs 31 it's sometimes described as the perfect wife, right? The perfect woman. She looks well to the ways of her household. It's the last chapter in the book of Proverbs. Her husband and her children rise up and call her blessed. But as Judges 4 and 5 remind us, there's no reason a woman can't be all of that, and much more. Deborah is a role model, and not just for women. She's a role model for all of us. And one of the things I love about her is that she's a great leader. She's a great leader. She didn't try to do everything herself. Smart leaders don't do that. Smart leaders delegate. And that's what she did. She came up with a plan. I mean, she was smart in that way to defeat a formidable and well-armed enemy. She went out and she hired the best guy that she could think of to lead her troops. She didn't lead the troops. She hired Barak to do that. And he's like, I ain't doing it unless you go with me. I mean, so he was smart enough to know that she was going to be key to winning this battle. So she was there, but he was the one that she called. And when it came to the coup de grace, the final blow, she relied on someone she knew she could trust, which in this case was another woman. Now, of course, it's not just Deborah's brilliant military victory that makes her a great role model. It's her faith. That's what made her who she was. It wasn't the fact that she was a great soldier, a great leader of soldiers and military stuff. When she was sitting under the tree, under that palm tree between Ramah and Bethel, imparting wise judgments as a prophetess for the 12 tribes, it wasn't her talent as a military strategist that brought people to her. People had no idea at that point that she was going to be a military leader. No, it was her faith. It was her intuition. It was her wisdom. That's what drew people to her before she did that other stuff. And that's why God was able to use her, I believe, in such a powerful way. A few weeks ago, we held a funeral service here for Dolores Lofton. Some of you may have been here for that service, maybe even saw it online. Dolores was the first woman elder of First Christian Church. And there was a brief mention of that fact in her obituary. But as I pointed out on the day of the funeral, when Dolores was elected to that position for the first time in this church, a woman being chosen as an elder 50 years ago, that was a big deal. I mean, it was a really big deal. It took boldness and courage on her part and on the part of the leadership of the church at that time, and there were repercussions. Some of you were alive then and remember those repercussions. But I can't imagine a more perfect person to have filled that role than her. One of the things I often say to our nominating committee, especially when they go look for new elders and deacons, is to find people who are already fulfilling those roles, but don't have the formal title yet, right? So in other words, go look for people like Deborah who are sitting under a palm tree somewhere, right? Dispensing wisdom and faith. Look for them. Look for the teachers. Look for the helpers. Look for the role models. Look for people who embody and exemplify the love and the ministry of Jesus, and then make it official. That's our job in the church. Dolores Lofton was an elder. She just was. Just like Deborah was a judge over ancient Israel. That's who God created them to be. Period. That era of the judges really, in a lot of ways, was a golden time in Israel's history. Of course, it wasn't perfect, which is why God had to continue to raise up new judges every now and then in order to lead Israel back into faithfulness, because they had that cycle of faithfulness and unfaithfulness going on. But like all good things, the era of the judges eventually came to an end. So the people, and we know this because the Bible tells us the story. It tells the truth about Israel and about us. And in the Bible, it tells us that the people of Israel went to Samuel, who was the very last judge, and they said, "We want a king. We want to be like other nations." And of course, Samuel, as the judge of Israel at that time, his feelings were hurt, which makes sense. And God wasn't very happy about it either. We sometimes forget that. And so Samuel took Israel's request to God, and this was God's response to Samuel. God said to him, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not just rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, just as they have done to me from the day I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also are they doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice." Okay, so do what they say, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. And that's what Samuel did. He warned them. And everything he said would happen, happened. Because when the king sins, the whole country suffers, right? And that's exactly what God said would happen, and that's what happened. If Israel had been smart, they would have listened to Samuel, and they would have called that whole thing off, and they would have stuck with judges like Deborah. But that's not who they were. And apparently it's not who we are either, right? Like Israel, we always think the next king is going to solve all our problems, or the next queen. We're just sure that's going to solve it all. And at this point, I don't think there's any going back to anything like the leadership that we see in the judges of Israel. But here's the thing. That doesn't mean we personally can't be picky about who we choose as our role models. We need to be picky. And for me, it doesn't get much better than Deborah. It doesn't get much better than Dolores Lofton. But who comes to your mind? I'm guessing that some of the people on your list would be people who are formally recognized leaders, right? People that have been identified as leaders, but I'm guessing that many aren't, because role models don't have to be formally recognized. In the end, that doesn't really matter. What matters, what does matter, is who you look up to. It matters who you choose as your role models, because whether you realize it or not, you're probably becoming like them. You're adopting the things that are important to them, what they value, their behavior. That's what you're modeling. If there's one thing I hope you take home from you in this sermon, and every other sermon really in this series, it's this: choose your role models wisely.